Hi, you're listening to episode 3 of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. Today, David Perry is here. He's Vice President and Senior Analyst at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. David is a trusted source on Canadian defence and procurement policy. He's worked for or partnered with institutes like Macdonald Laurier, the Conference of Defence Associations, and the Canadian Naval Review. Currently, he's an adjunct professor at the Centre for Military and Strategic Studies at the University of Calgary and a research fellow at the Centre for the Study of Security and Development at Dalhousie. I'm told he also has his own podcast on the Canadian Global Affairs Institute podcast network called Defence Deconstructed, which I'll link to in the description of this episode, so be sure to check that out as well. David joins me virtually today to discuss security and defense. I hope you enjoy the conversation. So, David, with the COVID pandemic, with the protests on race relations all consuming the television screens and the front pages, most of the other news kind of disappears, of course, until there was the decision on the UN Security Council seat and Canada's failed bid to achieve that. So I want to put that in the context of defense issues and foreign policy issues, because a lot of people are saying that that was our only foreign policy bid. We really put all our eggs in that basket, and now we're not there. So what does that mean?
Yeah, I think it's kind of, I would put it almost with a piece with the front half of the Trudeau government. They're kind of effectively their only foreign policy revolved around the NAFTA renegotiations.
Right.
And that was, I think, undertaken for all the right reasons. But I guess it's reflective of the fact that we got to be able to do more than one thing at once. It's a big world. We have lots of interests and many different interests for Canada to pursue and advance in the world, values to promote in different ways if we want to do that as well. But the UN effort, like the NAFTA effort before it, I think just seemed to have consumed so much of the oxygen and so much of the bandwidth amongst the folks in this country that need to do foreign policy. So it's unfortunate that we lost, but I don't think it was all that surprising.
What difference does it make at this point? The Security Council, the China, Russia, U.S. vetoes, does it matter? Would we have really made a difference?
I don't know, because I'm just not clear about what we had intended to do if we won. That platform at the United Nations Security Council is an important one if you can get a seat there. I guess I was never clear about what the objective was in winning the seat. I mean, it seemed to me to be the largest driving factor was a desire to differentiate from the previous government, which had also failed. So now that we've got 2 consecutive failures to win a seat, I think we got to reassess, one, what our chances of actually winning this particular election, which is effectively what it is, and how much of what happened as a result of kind of the election factors about how you win the votes there and what you need to do to cross that threshold. And then the other component of it would, I think, hopefully be some reflection about, the kind of the implicit tie-in with what it means for how our international policy is viewed externally compared to how we view it ourselves. And I think
exactly. We seem to have this sense that we're much more muscular and much more present and much more important than we are. I mean, when you look at Norway, that has more boots on the ground for peacekeeping than we do, and
Right.
that's part of our whole, quote, identity,
Right.
there's something wrong here.
Well, and also keeping in mind that they're much smaller countries too. But I think
Exactly.
that's really I would hope that this should create some self-reflection about how we're doing in terms of our international policy about actually achieving and advancing Canadian national interests, and less about perception either of ourselves or kind of this constant Canadian fixation of obsessing over how other people view us and whether or not we're perceived to be fighting in the right weight class.
It's having lived in the United States, I always get that sense that somehow, when you're the smaller neighbor, not geographically, but population-wise and in terms of clout, we're always comparing ourselves to the U.S. We're so much better. Our values are so much truer. We're not the bullies. Like we define ourselves by what we're not, as opposed to defining ourselves by what we are. I
Oh,
guess it's
absolutely.
figuring out what it is that we're supposed to be. What is it that, as you say, that we're trying to achieve? What should we be doing? What should we be trying to achieve?
Right. And I think on the values bit, certainly the public-facing communications that came out of our diplomatic establishment, we're trying to extol that Canada should be, we should, a vote for Canada should be done because we were inclusive and promote diversity, and that we were leaders in the COVID response internationally. And there's a third
And
thing I'm
there's
forgetting.
50% women in cabinet, like
Right.
issues that aren't relevant to what a foreign policy is generally described as.
Well, maybe, or you could argue that they are, but to me, the bigger thing was if you're looking at the votes we needed at the UN Security Council or at the United Nations to get that seat, it's a question of
Right,
one, whether or not those issues were ones that would actually make countries vote for us,
right.
number one. And then number two, even if, yes, those are the kinds of things that would lead a country to select a rotating member of the United Nations Security Council, were those going to be points of differentiation between Canada and the Irish and the Norwegians? And I think it was a stretch to think that that was the case.
Can we put this decision now in the light of where we're still at on the COVID front? We look at $1 trillion worth of debt and a deficit that's going up literally hourly. Do you anticipate that the defense world, the Defense Department, is going to take a big hit in terms of cuts to try and start the payback system that will inevitably happen?
So I guess the way that I would answer that by saying that when a government, whoever that is and whenever that is, wants to start getting our fiscal house in order, and I think that that is inevitable, unless somehow magically interest rates and debt carrying costs remain minuscule for forever, some government is going to have an issue with
Yep,
Canada's debt load, even if it isn't in terms of the absolute amounts. But I think, and it's important to keep in mind that at least currently, the world is just massively awash in debt right now. And in
exactly.
Canada, we have a bit of a unique circumstance. I think because of our federal structure, it's not just the federal debt, it's also how much debt provinces are carrying. We've already seen in the last couple of months one province make an explicit ask to the federal government for help, basically going to the market to secure lending. So I think there's going to be a relative lending issue potentially of how people evaluate Canada's total indebtedness picture compared to other places where they could lend their dollars. And but the takeaway for me is that whenever it happens that a government wants to start restraining spending, it's inevitable that defense plays some part in that, just because it is the single largest line item that is really adjustable when you get into crunching down on the federal budget math and looking what levers you can pull if you want to reduce overall federal government expenditures.
This is always the problem because the procurement system in this country, which I think is so fundamentally broken, it takes us so long to make a decision. It then takes us so long to purchase, and then political governments come and go and decisions change. We seem to be stuck in this rut of buying old equipment, not making a decision on putting us in tune and in line with our NATO partners and allies. Where are we on that? I mean, it kind of goes back to that other question about whether we are who we think we are in terms of what we do in the real world and boots on the ground. Ships, planes, um, really dealing with second rate, third rate aging equipment.
Yeah, and I think it ties in exactly to the question about whether or not defense is liable to be cut and how defense figures into the overall federal fiscal picture. Because I would say just kind of as a frame on where we are right now with defense and military procurement, especially, the planes and the ships that you mentioned should have been replaced 20 years ago.
Exactly.
We were in the middle, though, at the time of digging Canada out from the most recent massive debt load, one that was much more significant than what happened in after the 2010 period, after we got out from underneath the Great Recession. But in the early in the mid 90s, we were in serious trouble about whether or not we could actually keep servicing the debt and whether or not we could actually keep borrowing money. And for a whole bunch of reasons, we went into a period where we had, for about a decade and a half, significant reductions in spending on defense, and particularly acute ones in terms of what we were doing in terms of replacing equipment that, given the nature of how long it takes to buy some of these advanced weapon systems, no matter where you are in the world, we should have been doing it then, and we didn't. So here we are, a generation later, still flying and still sailing the same pieces of equipment in some cases. And what that's done is it's kind of created this cumulative problem of stacking up demand
Mm-hmm.
where in addition to just being, we should be working on the procurements right now for equipment that's say 25 years old, which is, that's kind of like a normal replacement cycle. But we're trying to get supply ships, and we just saw a contract for that recently for ships
Right.
that were retired when they were in their mid 40s. And as someone that's approaching that age window, that's not really the prime of your operational life.
Well, I mean, it's such a serious question when you look at the helicopter crash, the cyclone crash, and we don't know all of the answers there yet. But I think it's fair to say that there was an unfamiliarity with equipment. Maybe we didn't have the right training up to speed, or maybe the company hadn't delivered. We've got search and rescue planes, that's starting to be fixed, but ones that can't get up in the air. And I'm worried too when you look at the recent snowbird crash, that the first thing they do is kind of, I mean, of course the planes are old. We know they're really, really old. Is it easier just to cut the program than try and fix it? Those are the things that concern me because I mean, the snowbirds are about Canadians feeling good about themselves and understanding and have some relationship to their military that we don't have in the same way that the Americans or other countries do.
Yeah, I mean, so to take those examples that you cited, I think the way that I would frame all of them, as well as a lot of other older fleets that we have, is that Canada has developed, for good reasons and bad, a reputation as being an excellent operator of far
Right.
too old equipment. And we've become very good and very adept at doing that. And I think by and large, put an awful lot of time of making sure that there isn't an automatic connection between platform age and safety, because we do focus on the safety despite other things that happen. Uh, but having an international reputation as an excellent operator of old equipment isn't really a good one.
Yeah. So, do you see any change possible on that? Do you see that there might be some connection now with this failed attempt at the UN to have a rethink and say, okay, look, I mean, we need to put our money where our mouth is if we're going to be an international player.
I think it all depends on what kind of self-assessment and self-reflection happens. If it's of the type that happened after our failed bid in 2010, which, and I think too many official circles and too many of the kind of the diplomatic establishment was attributed all to their perceived ills of the Harper government.
Hmm.
If we kind of get a knee-jerk reflection that it's, this is all attributable to, some people are saying that the prime minister is a lightweight. I think that's a vast oversimplification, and it won't do us any help. If it actually occasions us to actually take a real look at both what we want to do in terms of an actual policy framework or policy outline, but also what we're actually doing. And I think it's the doing that's really the critical part.
Hmm.
We can review policy endlessly, but I think, and a lot of people could fault Canada for this, that they're looking at the connection between what we say we're going to do and what then we actually get out and do in the world. So I think a lot of the focus needs to be on the doing and what and how we're doing that, whether or not that matches with what we said we're going to do, and whether or not other people would perceive us to be living up to what we're trying to do. Particularly if we want to take a position where we want to be cautioning a lot of other people about how they should engage in the world. I think if you're going to be
Exactly.
lecturing other people about their behavior, you really need to make sure that your own rhetoric equates with your own particular actions.
100% agree with that. What do you make of us going back into supporting Ukrainian troops, etc.? Is this a, do we have we contributed enough to make a difference? I guess is my question.
Um, I think to this point we have, in the sense that we've sort of frozen that conflict. I think getting a fulsome resolution of that is going to be difficult. I think
Right.
obviously the COVID overlay here
Yep.
makes things a lot more problematic. I think that really kind of fundamentally changes the cost benefit assessment about any of our international contributions. For entirely legitimate reasons. Like, you don't just have the risk of operational stress injuries or operational conflict affecting our troops internationally. You have them dealing with stressed and strained Canadian medical support and supply lines, or relying on local health authorities to be able to protect them from a particularly nasty disease. And in a circumstance where we're doing that, certainly it's a lot longer travel and supply line to have our troops there than certainly the Russians, and the various forms of support they're providing on the other side. So I understand the rationale for dialing it back. I'm not really clear about what the next steps are in Ukraine writ large.
Yeah.
By no means an expert in the region, but I certainly think that all of the kind of the tribulations of the Trump administration haven't made solving that particular issue any easier by any means.
You've twigged something in my mind here talking about military operations in the world of COVID. Do you think troops should be sent into old folks' homes to do the job of people who should have been hired and paid properly to do that job?
I mean, if that's legitimately the only alternative, then certainly if it was my grandparents in one of those facilities,
Mm-hmm.
I would be extraordinarily happy to see those people there. But I mean, fundamentally, absolutely not. I mean, it is, I think, kind of insane that we have troops that is their contribution to COVID, and it had to rely on the federal armed forces to be in there running care homes. I mean, that is such a complete and systemic failure to have to, and it's not just been a short while, and it looks like they're going to be there for a
Exactly.
number of months, potentially through the summer. It really just kind of boggles my mind that that is the step to which we had to go,
Mm-hmm.
and not just on a temporary basis. I mean, that I think would have been more understandable, but the fact that you've got provinces now that want to have those soldiers and other service personnel there through Labor Day, I mean, that just speaks volumes to the degree to which that whole system to me is just broken.
Completely broken. This is always the tension when the Canadian military. I mean, unless they're in an operation like Afghanistan, and then people pay attention because it's on the news at night, or they may have a son or a niece or a nephew going off to actually go into battle. Where most people see their military, and because our bases are kind of hidden away, a lot of Canadians don't even see our military, but they see them fighting fires or sandbagging during floods, and now in old folks' homes. I It troubles me, and I don't know if there's an issue there of we're changing the emphasis of what our military is. It's supposed to, in my mind, be there at the ready for much larger conflicts than just solving domestic crises.
I absolutely agree with that, and I think if you look over the last 4 years and a bit, sort of the pre-COVID period, because everything that happened
Right.
after COVID is kind of I would put in a different
Yeah.
bucket.
Yeah.
But I don't think that you could find very many people at all, even people relatively attentive, that had any clue how actually involved we were in the world militarily. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
at one point, we still had a couple of thousand troops deployed. Um, Very, very little mention was ever made about it. We had very sporadic and infrequent briefings about the troops that we had in the Ukraine, the troops that we had in the Middle East, and the ones that we sent for the time that we sent them to Mali. So uh, I think there was a real kind of disconnect between the degree to which there was any emphasis on that international contribution and the sort of the more traditional types of military operations relative to the actual number of people that we had out the door, which, keep in mind, it wasn't huge, but it
Mm.
certainly, I think, was vastly higher than you would have been led to believe by the way the government went about discussing it.
So that's an ongoing problem. How do we make that change? I think it has to sort of come from activity at some point, but how do we get people thinking in our country that we need a military? It needs to be funded, it needs to be at the ready, and it's just not there to do backup. Other countries have a national guard or they have other people to call upon in terms of crisis, and they don't bring the military in to bat cleanup.
Yeah, I mean that's a real tricky. It's a real tricky question. I mean, I think fundamentally it's trying to get people to better understand how dependent Canada is on the rest of the world. And I think to go back to something you said before, we just have, I think, at times this myopic fixation on what's happening in the U.S. and not even in the entire United States. What's happening at the White House?
At the White House, yeah, that's
And
it.
there's so much of the
Absolutely.
rest of the world that either, even if we have a direct reliance on something that's happening, say, economically in the United States, it in turn, a lot of the times, is tied into through trade or wider security connections about what's happening on the rest of the globe. And if you don't have people that you can send out internationally in different capacities, and not just soldiers, but diplomats too, and particularly diplomats, I think we need more of, then you don't have as good as assurance that you can advance Canada's interests around the world if you don't have the people to do it and if you don't send them out to be engaged.
I want to come full circle here and back to where we started, which is what is our foreign policy? Do we have one? What context are we all operating in? And then I'm going to say one word and then I'm going to let you talk for a minute. China.
Um, I think we have a lot of work to do with our relationship with China. I think we've had glasses that are tinted with various colors for too long. And I don't think that we have our heads around how fundamental the shift is internationally in terms of China's ascendance and the relative, not just decline of the United States, but disengagement of the United
Right.
States, which I think too many Canadians are attributing to being a Trump phenomenon. And at least personally, I don't think that it's just Trump and you
Couldn't
can
agree
replace
more.
him.
Yeah, I
We
think the
may.
decline of the American empire is underway and has been.
Right,
Yeah,
and I don't think that all the toothpaste goes back in that tube. If you
exactly.
get a changing government, you get a Biden presidency with the next election. And for Canada, dating back to the end of the Second World War, has been fundamentally reliant on the American security architecture, American leadership. I think that we should all be doing a massive stock taking right now that COVID, which has been I think arguably one of the most significant international crises since the Second World War, has not only had no American leadership, but effectively no global leadership of any kind. And for a smaller country like Canada, that is a really, I think, fundamental shift. That our primary security partner for the last multiple generations is basically playing
Mhm.
little to no international role on this particular worldwide crisis and by choice.
And we have to figure out what our relationship is going to be. The China, which is a poor, starving, staggering giant, and in need of direction and guidance, and we were going to send our private sector people over there to teach and lead, and governments. That's not who they are. They're the superpower at this point, and we have to decide how we're going to deal with them. And I think Canadians have had a change of heart on a lot of issues through the COVID crisis. Did they lie to us? Did they send us faulty goods? Should we be purchasing their goods? Look what they've done to our canola farmers and our hog producers, and it's endless, the battles that we've got, and we don't seem to be standing up and speaking aloud about what the issues are, not even to mention Huawei.
Yeah, and the Canadian prisoners or
Mm-hmm.
hostages, I guess, that have been taken. And
No,
it,
exactly. That's
yeah, that the whole dynamic. I think one of the other things to keep in mind for Canada, because we're going to remain inextricably linked to the United States for the foreseeable future. I think also there's not enough recognition in Canada that the evolving American attitude towards China is one of the few apparently bipartisan issues
mm-hmm.
that exists in the United States right now. There's too many people that are attributing the kind of current government in the United States' stance towards China and the tougher stance as being a Trump phenomenon, a Republican phenomenon. It's an American phenomenon, and it's
Mm-hmm.
reflective of the fact that China, while it is a massive market, and there's economic potential for Canada given the structure of our economy, and there's the potential for increased commerce. They are also on the other side of a security and strategic equation from Canada and Canada's traditional allies. And I don't know that we've really kind of caught on to that fact right now. It's not just a market opportunity. It's a major strategic challenger to the side of the global security equation that Canada rests on. And it also potentially directly affects some of Canada's security interests through things like Huawei and Chinese activity of various different kinds across Canada.
Do you think we'll get the two Michaels back?
I at this point I don't have a lot of confidence, and without in any way diminishing their situation, it's also I think really kind of remarkable to keep in mind just how much two consular cases, and again not to diminish those, has taken over uh, our relationship with one of the world's superpowers,
Right.
um, and we don't I think there's lots of reasons to say that Canada's judicial system moves slowly, but boy, if there's ever a case with the Huawei CFO to get resolution of whichever way it is going to be resolved as
Yeah.
fast as you could, boy, that would be one to try and expedite.
Anything else that you're seeing on the horizon that none of us are seeing because of of COVID and, as I say, the race relations issues that are front and center? Are we missing something key out there that you see that we don't?
I think we're missing lots of things. Across government, I think that we need to get back to having more legislating. It's kind of ridiculous to have a one-track issue only governance system right now. Not to diminish in any way how important COVID is,
Yep.
but we've got the entire rest of our socioeconomic structure and other policy objectives that we need to be thinking about. There's lots happening on the defense front, or at least lots that should be happening. And it would be great to see that perspective get broadened out. I mean, I think the one thing, and you already touched on it, I think we need to fundamentally get our heads around how we deal with the shifting relationship that we've got with China, and as well at the same time, and it's kind of a triangular situation with how the United States role in the world has shifted and what that means for a country that has had such an inextricable tie with the United States, to have them no longer be interested in providing the type of global
Yeah.
leadership that they have for so long. That's got a massive implication for a country that has really been in the slipstream of American initiatives for decades.
So good to talk to you, and we are all grateful that you were out thinking big thoughts on these issues, talking about them, writing about them, and thanks for talking about them with us. Appreciate it.
Great to see you virtually. Look forward to doing it again in person.
For sure. David Perry, Vice President and Senior Analyst at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute in Ottawa. Great insights from him and a lot of no-nonsense conversation. We'll see you again next time.